That aircraft is a museum piece, and frankly, so is the pilot. He said it loud enough for the whole room to hear, loud enough for it to echo off the operations center walls, past the glowing tactical screens, past the junior officers who suddenly found their keyboards very interesting. Brigadier General Curtis Hale had a gift for that, for filling a room with his certainty, for making silence feel like agreement. The aircraft in question was parked at the far end of the flight line, under a weathered shelter that the newer jets didn't need. It was squat and gray, and enormous in a way that had nothing to do with elegance. Its nose was a blunt, almost bovine shape. Its cockpit sat far forward, like an afterthought, perched on top of a flying gun. The ground crews called it the Warthog. The fast jet crowd called it other things. Mostly they didn't call it anything at all. Mostly they pretended it wasn't there. And the pilot they had assigned to it, they pretended she wasn't there either. Major Elaine Doss had been flying A-10s for 19 years. She had the kind of face that didn't announce itself, the kind of posture that occupied exactly the space it needed, and no more. Her hair was regulation short. Her uniform was faded in the places uniforms fade when they have seen real use. She sat in the corner of the briefing room every morning and drank her coffee and watched the weather maps and said almost nothing. The general had decided, somewhere in the first week after his arrival at the forward operating location, that she was furniture. Experienced furniture, maybe. The kind you keep around because getting rid of it takes paperwork, but furniture nonetheless. He was briefing the strike package when the call came in. 4 aircraft down. A carefully coordinated trap sprung in a mountain valley 60 kilometers from the Iranian frontier. The mission had been a strike escort, and it had walked into something that intelligence had not predicted and the pilots had not survived to describe. Interceptors above, a dense belt of surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery below. And in the valley, on the valley floor, 27 men and women from the downed crews, some mobile, some not, all of them in a killing box that was getting smaller by the minute. General Hale looked at the tactical display for a long time. He looked at the SAM threat rings, overlapping like poisoned flowers across the terrain map. He looked at the fighter assets remaining, none of them built to survive what that valley was radiating. He looked at the rescue helicopter assets, which were already being requested on 3 different frequencies, and which would be torn apart the moment they crossed the threshold. Then he made his decision. "We are not sending aircraft into that box," he said. "I am issuing a standing order. No assets penetrate that threat envelope. Those crews are a total loss. We do not compound the catastrophe." The room was silent. Not the silence of agreement, the silence of people who understood that he was right, mathematically, tactically, in every way that a general staff briefing measures rightness, and who hated him for it, who hated themselves for understanding it. Major Doss set down her coffee cup. It made almost no sound. She looked at the map for exactly 30 seconds. She looked at the SAM rings, and then she looked at something else. Something the others were not looking at, because they were looking at the threat. She was looking at the terrain, the ridgelines, the valleys within valleys, the corridors that a fast jet would never use, because a fast jet needed altitude to survive, needed speed, needed the margin of height that kept it outside the reach of ground fire. She was not flying a fast jet. She stood up. She did not ask permission. She did not announce her intention. She picked up her helmet bag from under the chair where it had been sitting all morning, the way it sat every morning, and she walked toward the door with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman going to do a thing she has done many times before. Captain Reeves, the assistant operations officer, was the one who noticed. He was 26 years old, and he had been at the location for 11 days, and he had not yet learned to read the specific quality of silence that follows a decision that cannot be undone. "Major," he said, "the general issued a standing order." She paused at the door. She did not turn around. "Yes, he did," she said. Then she went through it. The crew chief, Staff Sergeant Abner Ortiz, was a broad-shouldered man from Albuquerque who had been maintaining A-10s for 14 years. He had the specific wariness of someone who has learned to read pilots the way other people read weather. When he saw Major Doss crossing the flight line with her helmet bag, and her pace, and her expression, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck do something they did not ordinarily do. "Major," he said, "we're not scheduled for sortie." "We are now," she said. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He had seen that particular quality of stillness in exactly two other pilots in his career. Both of them had gone on to do things that were later described in briefings with the word unprecedented. He began the pre-flight checks. The Warthog's engines began their long, grinding spool-up. In the operations center, someone noticed. Then someone else noticed. The radio traffic spiked. General Hale was told. He was told once, then again, because the first time the words had not fully assembled themselves into meaning. "Who authorized that aircraft?" he said. No one answered, because no one had. On the flight line, Major Elaine Doss was completing her walk-around. She ran her hand along the titanium belly of the aircraft, along the thick-walled bathtub of armor that surrounded the cockpit, the feature the engineers had built in because they understood that this aircraft was going to absorb hits that would destroy anything with thinner skin. She had always found that honest. There was something deeply honest about an aircraft that was designed not to dodge the bullets but to survive them. She climbed in. She strapped in. She ran through her checklist with the calm efficiency of someone for whom checklists are not formality but liturgy. The radio crackled. General Hale's voice. "Warthog 04, you are not authorized for departure. Return to parking. Acknowledge." She keyed her mic. "Acknowledged," she said. Then she taxied. The Warthog lifted from the runway at a time that no one in the operations center would later be able to agree on exactly, because the moment had the quality of something that happens between instants. One moment she was rolling. The next moment she was gone. Low. Immediately, strangely, impossibly low, following the ground like a shadow, dropping into the first fold of terrain that swallowed her from radar and from sight. She flew at treetop level, not metaphorically, literally. The branches of the scrub cedars that covered the lower ridgelines were close enough that she could have counted them if she had been counting anything other than her heading and her altitude and the timing of the terrain as it rose and fell beneath her. This was not the way the A-10 was typically flown. This was the way the A-10 had been built to be flown, in the design specifications that the fast jet pilots had never bothered to read, by engineers who had understood something about certain kinds of wars. The threat radar was not finding her. The SAM systems that had destroyed 4 aircraft that morning were not finding her. She was beneath their gaze, in the terrain folds, in the noise floor of the mountains, a gray ghost moving through a world that thought it knew where everything was. She could hear the radio traffic from the valley. Fragmented transmissions, voice discipline breaking down at the edges, the way it does when people are afraid, and holding it together by will alone. She could hear call signs she recognized. Captain Wren, who had sat 2 rows ahead of her in yesterday's briefing and complained about the coffee. Lieutenant Morales, who was 24 years old. Others. 27 of them. She pushed the throttles forward into the valley approach. The ambush was professional. She would give them that. The first AAA opened up from a ridgeline to the northeast, a stream of tracers that would have been beautiful if beauty were the category she was sorting things into. She broke left and low, felt the rounds walk across the right wing, heard the familiar sound of impacts that the titanium absorbed like a comment it had already heard and dismissed. The Warthog shuddered. She flew it through the shutter. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon ran through the nose of the aircraft like a spine, 30 millimeters, the barrel cluster rotating at 4,000 rounds per minute, a sound like the end of an argument. She lined up on the first AAA position and fired a burst that lasted less than 2 seconds and turned that position into a crater and a silence, and then she was already moving, already turning, already finding the next problem. The valley was a horseshoe of mountains. The floor was maybe 3 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide. On the ridgelines and the slopes, she could see the setup now, the geometry of it, the way it had been laid to destroy aircraft that would come in fast and high. It was a brilliant ambush, designed for the aircraft that had been sent and destroyed. It was not designed for this. It was not designed for something that came in from below, from the inside, from the place the geometry left undefended, because no one believed anything would come from there. She made her first orbit at 200 feet. The GAU-8 found the second AAA nest on the southwest slope, found the SAM crew reorienting their launcher toward a threat that was not coming from where their system told them threats came from, found the infantry element on the valley floor that had been moving to consolidate on the crash sites. She could feel the hits, not pain. The aircraft absorbing them, the structure flexing, the systems degrading in ways that the damage control panel reported in amber and red, the hydraulics bleeding, the fuel state changing in ways that were not part of the plan, the wing structure taking impacts that were recorded and distributed across the airframe in ways the engineers had anticipated and she had studied. She kept flying. She kept orbiting. The radios in the valley were changing. The voices were still afraid, but the fear was changing shape, from the closed fear of people who believe they are going to die to the open fear of people who cannot believe what they are seeing. Someone was transmitting her call sign. Someone was transmitting it repeatedly, not because they needed a response, but because saying it out loud was the only way to confirm it was real. 04, a voice said, and then nothing else, and then, after a long pause, "Are you still there?" "Still here," she said. She was on her 4th orbit when the helicopters arrived. The rescue package, which had been holding at the boundary of the threat envelope, which had been told it could not penetrate the box, which had nevertheless been holding, waiting, because the crews aboard them were the kind of people who hold and wait rather than turn around and go home. They had been listening to the radio traffic. They had heard the cannon. They had watched on their sensors as threat emitters went offline one by one. They had made their own decision. The first helicopter crossed the threshold at the 31st minute. Major Doss was on her 7th orbit. Her fuel was critical. Her hydraulic system was operating on backup. Her right aileron was responding with a lag that required constant correction, a physical dialogue between pilot and aircraft conducted through the control stick with a patience and precision that only years produce. She held the orbit. She held it while the first helicopter landed and loaded and lifted. She held it while the second helicopter came in behind it. She held it while the valley, which had been a killing box, became a loading zone, became an evacuation point, became a place where 27 people who had been written off as a total loss climbed aboard aircraft and rose into the air. She held it until the last helicopter called clear. Then she turned north, toward the field, toward the runway that was already being prepared for an emergency recovery. The damage control panel was telling her things that she listened to and filed and addressed one at a time, in the order of their urgency. The aircraft was flying. It was flying badly, but it was flying, and the distinction between those two things was the only one that mattered. She put the Warthog on the runway 14 minutes later. The landing was not elegant. The right main gear came down hard. The aircraft yawed, she corrected. The tires smoked, and the aircraft rolled out and stopped, and she shut the engines down and sat in the cockpit for a moment in the sudden silence. Staff Sergeant Ortiz was the first one to reach the aircraft. He came up the ladder with the specific controlled urgency of someone who has been watching a damage panel on a remote feed and counting holes in an airframe from a distance and not allowing himself to draw conclusions. He looked at her face first. Then he looked at the aircraft. He stepped back down the ladder. He put his hand on the fuselage. He stood there for a moment without saying anything. The aircraft had taken 31 hits. The right wing had structural damage. The hydraulic system had lost 60% of its primary fluid. The cannon had fired 412 rounds. The fuel state at landing had been below the emergency minimum, low enough that the emergency minimum seemed, in retrospect, optimistic. The aircraft had flown anyway. That was what it was built to do. She was climbing down the ladder when the general's vehicle arrived. He stepped out with 2 aides and the JAG officer, the Judge Advocate General, who was already holding a document folder. The court-martial paperwork had been started while she was still airborne. The violation of a direct order was not a complicated charge. The general had built his career on the understanding that orders were the architecture of military effectiveness, and an order violated was a structure collapsed, regardless of outcome, regardless of intent. He walked toward her across the flight line with the contained fury of a man who is completely certain of his position. She stood at the base of the ladder and waited for him. He stopped 6 feet away. He looked at the aircraft. He looked at the holes. He looked at the smoke stains and the hydraulic fluid and the damaged wing. Then he looked at her. "Major Doss," he said, "you are hereby informed that you are subject to court-martial proceedings for willful violation of a direct lawful order. Do you have anything to say?" She thought about it for a moment. 27, she said. He blinked. "What?" 27. She said again. "That's what I have to say." She walked past him toward the debrief building. The court-martial was convened 18 days later. The Operations Center conference room had been reconfigured for the proceeding, with a long table at the front and a gallery of chairs behind it. The gallery was full. 27 of the chairs were occupied by the crews who had been recovered from the valley. Some of them were still in various stages of recovery, bandaged, splinted, moving with the careful deliberateness of people whose bodies were still negotiating with what had happened to them. They had all requested permission to attend. They had all received that permission. Captain Reeves, the assistant operations officer who had spoken to her at the door of the briefing room, had submitted a statement that ran to 11 pages. In it, he described in precise chronological detail what he had observed, what orders had been given, what the tactical situation had been, what assets had been available, what the general had declared. He described the standing order. He described her response to it. He described the subsequent events in the kind of unadorned factual language that reads, in military documents, like a verdict in its own right. Staff Sergeant Ortiz had submitted a technical statement regarding the state of the aircraft on recovery. He listed the hits, the system failures, the fuel state, the structural damage. He listed the 412 rounds expended. He noted, in the final line of his statement, that in his professional assessment, the aircraft should not have been capable of performing the maneuvers required to achieve the observed tactical effect. He left that observation without interpretation. He did not need to interpret it. The JAG officer, a colonel named Whitmore, who had a reputation for precision and an immunity to sentimentality, read both statements into the record. Then she read the mission log from the rescue helicopter package. Then she read the after-action statements from the helicopter crews. Then she read the communications transcript from the valley. General Hale sat at the front of the gallery. He had been offered a seat at the proceeding table, but had declined it. He sat in the gallery with his aides on either side of him, and he listened to each document read into the record, and his face did not change in a way that could be precisely described, but it changed. Somewhere between the helicopter mission log and the communications transcript, something shifted in his posture. Not defeat, not acknowledgement. Something quieter than either of those. Something that happens to a man when the architecture of his certainty meets something it was not built to support. Major Doss sat at the defendant's table. She sat straight. She sat still. She had the expression of someone attending a proceeding that she was present for but not exactly inside of. The presiding officer, a two-star general named Caldwell who had been flown in from Central Command, read the charges. He read them in the careful, unhurried voice of someone who has read charges before and understands that the careful pace of the reading is itself a form of respect for the proceeding. Then he read the supporting documentation that had been submitted prior to the hearing. He read Major Doss's service record aloud. He read it completely. 19 years of active service, 3 combat theaters, 2 distinguished flying crosses, a Bronze Star with Valor device, 4 air medals, a unit citation from a deployment that was still partially classified, the name of the unit redacted, the nature of the operation described in language that was precise about what it was not permitted to say. 11,300 hours in A-10 airframes. Qualification as an instructor pilot. Qualification as a weapons school graduate. A previous assignment, listed without elaboration, at a forward location, whose name, when the general read it aloud, caused 3 of the people in the gallery to sit up slightly straighter in their chairs. He set the folder down. The room was very quiet. He looked at General Hale. "You designated Major Doss's aircraft as a secondary asset," he said. It was not a question. General Hale said, "That is correct." "And you designated the crews in the valley as a total loss," he said. General Hale said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Based on available intelligence and threat assessment, yes." General Caldwell nodded slowly. He looked at the gallery. He looked at the 27 chairs. He looked at the people in them. "Based on available intelligence," he repeated, as though tasting the phrase to understand what it was made of. He was quiet for a long moment. "Major Doss," he said. "Sir," she said, "I have reviewed the charges against you. I have reviewed the tactical situation as it existed at the time of your departure. I have reviewed the outcome." He paused. "The charges are dismissed." He let that sit. "The grounds for dismissal," he continued, "are that the order violated was not, in my legal assessment, a lawful order under the circumstances, in that it directed the abandonment of personnel who remained recoverable. The determination that those personnel were unrecoverable was not supported by available means. A means existed. It was in the hangar." He closed the folder. "This proceeding is concluded." General Hale left the room without speaking. His aides went with him, 1 on each side, and the 3 of them moved through the door with the specific precision of people who are keeping themselves very controlled. The room watched them go in silence. Major Doss stood up from the defendant's table. She picked up her cover. She put it on with the automatic habit of 19 years. Captain Morales, who was 24 years old and had a healing fracture in his left arm from the crash, stood up from the gallery. He came to attention. He rendered a salute that was so precise and so sustained that the people around him understood without being told that it was not a formality. It was a statement. It was the kind of salute that means something specific and does not need translation. She returned it. Then she walked to the door, and she went through it, and she was already thinking about the maintenance report on the aircraft, and whether the wing spar could be repaired on site or would require depot-level work, and when the aircraft would be flyable again. General Hale was relieved of his command 14 days later. The official language cited command climate and judgment concerns. Unofficial language was not required. The people who needed to know already knew. In organizations like this one, the things that matter are rarely announced. They simply become part of the air. He was assigned to an administrative role at a training installation in the Midwest, where his particular gifts, the certainty, the volume, the confidence that never quite matched the wisdom that should have supported it, were unlikely to encounter anything that would test them to destruction again. It was a merciful assignment, in a way. He would not have described it that way. The Warthog was repaired. The wing spar required new components that took 9 days to arrive, and another 4 days of depot-level work by a team that Sergeant Ortiz supervised personally, sleeping in the hangar on 2 of those nights rather than return to quarters. When it was done, he walked around the aircraft 3 times before he signed the maintenance release. He had touched up the paint on the patched areas himself, in the evenings, working carefully, as though the aircraft were something that deserved the attention. Major Doss flew it the following week. A routine training sortie, low-level terrain following, the kind of mission that does not appear in any record that matters and does not need to. She flew it the way she always flew it, with the particular quality of communication between pilot and machine that takes years to develop and cannot be taught, only accumulated. She flew it low, along the ridgelines, where the terrain swallowed her from radar and from sight, and she was a gray shape moving through a world that did not know she was there. The story moved through the base in the way stories move in places like that, not through announcements, not through official communications, through the specific, organic propagation of information in communities small enough for one person to tell another, and for that person to tell 2 more, and for the shape of the story to stay true in the telling because the people telling it were there, because they had seen. New crews arriving at the location heard it from the crews who had been there. They heard it the way you hear things that matter in environments like that, not as briefing material, not as an instructional case study, but as a story, as something that happened, that was true, that you were expected to carry. And the count is still rising. The part they always told first was the standing order, the room going silent, everyone obeying, the general's voice and the certainty in it and the way that certainty could fill a space and make alternatives feel impossible. Then they told the part about the helmet bag, the way she had picked it up from under the chair where it had been sitting all morning, the way she had walked to the door, the one thing she had said, and then the door, and then she was gone. They told it because it was true. They told it because truth, in places like this, is the only currency that actually holds its value. Decorations can be given for the wrong reasons. Rank can be conferred on the wrong person. Certainty can be performed without being earned. But what happened in that valley, and what she did to make it unhappen, that was not a thing that could be conferred or performed or faked. It had to be done, and it had been done. The young pilots who heard the story heard it as a lesson, the way young pilots hear things. They heard it as instruction in the gap between noise and competence, between the appearance of authority and the thing that actually gets people out of boxes, when boxes have been declared unescapable. They heard it as a reminder that the most dangerous person in a room is sometimes the one sitting quietly in the corner, drinking her coffee, watching the weather maps, saying almost nothing. She was there, most mornings, sitting in the corner, drinking her coffee. The new ones would glance at her, the way you glance at furniture you have been told is historic, and then look away. The ones who had been there longer knew not to look away, because the helmet bag was still under her chair, and the weather maps were still on the screen. And somewhere, always, somewhere out beyond the wire, there was a valley that did not yet know what was coming for it. If you believe that the most dangerous soldier is the one who never needs to say so, type competence in the comments below. And if these stories mean something to you, there is a Patreon link in the description where you can help keep them coming. The warthog sat on the flight line under its weathered shelter. The fast-jet crowd still parked their aircraft at the other end. They still did not say much about it, but some of them, the ones who had heard the story, who had absorbed what it meant, some of them, when they walked past it in the early morning on the way to their own aircraft, would slow down, just for a moment, just to look at the patched wing and the blunt nose and the enormous gun running through its spine. And then they would walk on, and they would not say anything about it, because the people who understand what things mean do not usually need to say so. That is the whole of the lesson. That is all of it. And it has been true, in one form or another, in every military, in every era, in every war, and it will be true in whatever comes next. For more stories where quiet competence humbles loud arrogance, subscribe to Old Bill's Tales. And if you would like to help me keep telling them, you will find my Patreon linked in the description below. Thank you for standing with me.